You ready to go in?
Helen heard her own voice quiver as it croaked through the raw tissue of her throat, and her burning eyes hung so low it was as if having them open was merely a courtesy. The presence of rain weeping from the sorry heavens was, admittedly, a bit of comfort to her then. A soft, comfortable feeling she usually bedded down within. She had always loved those rainy nights, where she could lay in her bed and listen to the weather singing its enticing tune against her window. The world had seemed so small and deliberate, unachievable ground she was capable to conquer. The bedroom had been just her own back then. She didn't share its contents or her parents' affection. It was all for her. She stared unseeing at the front door of that same house, now having taken a whole new cast of inhabitants. Now 2 members were to enter it changed, if they could only work up the nerve. Pearls also saw gaze bore no actual sight, as she shot a deep yet surface-level stare into the tear-soaked material of her jeans, and pondered that stupid question. What did it matter if she was ready? She wasn't ready for any of this. Not for this day, nor for any of the assortment of fucking bullshit she'd spent hundreds going to therapy to unpack. Why should there suddenly be a need to ask? The universe had assumed she was already ready. Why not ask if she had been ready to receive that call today, and not about the action of walking inside a building? The smaller thing was worthy of having consent be granted, but not for anything that mattered. How was she supposed to do anything but laugh at hearing such an unnecessary question? So that's what she did. As the acidic tears couldn't help but well up all over again, she clasped a hand across them and gave a hoarse giggle, thick with redeveloping congestion and labored emotion.
Oh, sure. Obviously I am. Why not?
Helen attempted to retort to the reaction she couldn't begrudge her girl, but there was something, physical or otherwise, which had her voice all but die in her raw throat, and she furiously shook her head with a crumpled lip at the painful insistence her own tears had on resurging. She wanted to say she understood because she truly did. She wanted to say that she was sorry because she truly was. She wanted to say that she loved her because she truly did. She wanted to say she was and always would be there for her because she truly was. She wanted to say anything at all. But what benefit would any of those seemingly empty words have against anything? What could any of them do to ease these horrific emotions for her? It's not as if none of them would understand the pain of this event. 2 in particular knew this all too fucking well. But at least in their cases, if nothing else, they had been in the same country when they'd experienced it. Pearl didn't share in that, and Helen knew that was the thing killing her the most. Pearl currently stood with her back against oblivion, and any empty work of condolence was nothing but a thread for her to pull herself up with. It would have to be with her own strength that she saved herself, but if she could, Helen at least desired to provide her with a safe place to regain that strength, even if it was with a safety net of strands of her own hair. She would do that for her. She quite honestly owed her that, for the years of toxicity she had just put her through. This nightmare was taking place mere months after they had confessed their feelings to each other. Thus, her treating Pearl with even a shred of decency was an entirely new development. Just months before, she'd like to think she wouldn't have turned her back on her at this time, but that wasn't something she could say with any form of certainty. That's disgusting, she knew that, but it was the truth. If how she had treated her through their shared grieving of their brother and fiancé respectively was anything to go off of, the answer wasn't favourable. She felt nothing but disgust for herself for her relatively recent behaviour, and she could be nothing but grateful that, if this horrible fucking scenario had to take place, that it did so after she started her recovery, because she couldn't imagine experiencing this and having someone treat her the way she had for the past few years at the same time. She owed her this, wholly and utterly. The woman she hoped to marry, She owed this to her.
We should go inside.
She heard Pearl mutter under her breath, and looked over to see her straightening back up, not having noticed she had bent over and had been resting her head on the dashboard. Through the burning curtain of tears watering down her vision, she could clearly see just how heavy Pearl's eyelids hung, and at how puffy yet otherwise gaunt her face had become over the course of their harrowing drive. She normally ran on the paler side, but she truly looked completely drained of life right then, skin almost translucent under the watery luminance of the night sky. Helen had had her eyes on the road for much of the past few hours, and when they had stopped those few times in the first hour after receiving the call to cry without fear of crashing the car, and then to get something for Pearl to drink from her running out of tears to cry, only for her stomach to immediately reject it, Helen hadn't felt capable of really taking her in, as if afraid that if she hovered, Pearl would assume she was just going to revert back to her old ways, when that could not be further from the truth. But it wasn't like she could blame her for assuming such a thing. Not too long ago, she'd never given her a reason to believe otherwise. To really, truly take it in now, she immediately felt the familiar ache digging into the base of her throat, and she brought a shaky hand up to wipe at her eyes, clearing, she hoped, the painful mass from her throat as she forced her voice to cooperate with her.
We should, before the rain gets any heavier.
They were really doing this. Well, they didn't have a choice, did they? Time to come inside and face their friends. Time for Pearl to lean heavier into that silent oblivion. Helen hoped the quiet wouldn't become too smooth of a suitor. After Helen pulled her flannel in closer and she saw Pearl do the same with her leather jacket, they took a final collective breath through their stuffy noses before stepping out from the car and making their way to the house. Perhaps you expect them to rush to the porch to save themselves from the rain, and perhaps they also anticipated the same. But the moment the damp coolness of the breeze and the forceful embrace of the rain hit their exhausted bodies, they could think of nowhere else they would rather be than here. There existed never a moment of urgency, never a whisper of reason. Here the grand expanse of all that was, all that has ever been, and all that ever will eventuate, sung them lullabies, soothed their souls, straight from the dust of stars. They stood upon a loving earth, the cosmos sung them to mental sleep, and angels' tears were wept in consolidation against their frankly splintering skin. Here they reconnected back to that place of safety, to that place where their souls had initially broken free of the same star. How matter had attempted to break them apart, only for starry tendrils to remain entwined, ready to dance their way into the world. In those moments where their course was to Earth, they could think of nowhere else they would rather be than here. The universe knows no discrimination, and it would be there that they would give one last dance. They knew their fate, knew they would eventually be separated to find each other again. But for this final moment before they met absolution, they would hold each other and dance to the music only they could hear. Before they would be ripped apart, let them think on the other so that they became a burning memory. On God's grace, give them this last dance, lovers from the stars that they were. And she did. Through oblivion's beginning they soared, hand in hand, down but never falling, and up into the embrace of home. But truly now, home was here, in each other's arms. No physical destination could compare to the home their love created. Nothing could come above the purity of this. Atop the galaxies they twirled the other, their better half. Upon comets they raced, and beneath moonbeams they basked. Nothing and nowhere was left untouched in this final dance they took together while in this form. One would be left here for years to come, and one would experience the stricken throes of livelihood entirely in her lonesome. Both would have to use every bit of themselves to be reunited. And they had. Where starry hands were clutched tight in the other, came arms of flesh and bone, and where stardust and stratosphere fell away, fell frigid rain. Here they were in this space, having been unmoving beneath the stormy sky, only to come together in an unconscious imitation of that final dance so long ago. Arm in loving arm, they swayed together in a miserable union, taking turns leaning into each other and allowing this contact to move their bodies in a half-hearted, unwilling waltz. Drunk of fatigue and misery, their stinging eyes closed as their bodies took over. Already knowing this story, having imagined it so much, it became more like a memory. The flesh remembers, even after its reanimation, and it led them both here. Where he was being more of the question. But that didn't matter. Nowhere they'd ever been was more important than this one moment, dancing beneath the rain to a song they couldn't necessarily hear. Felt being the more accurate description. A cosmic instinct, a safe familiar, an unconscious imitation, indeed. The dance found a natural lull, but instead of seeing its pause, this instinctive routine continued on, seeing the taller member being dipped, her long cascade of hair flowing past her shoulders down to the gathering puddles beneath them. The effortless hold she felt securely beneath her back was a safety she could scarcely believe was even possible. But here it was, her safety, dipping her beneath the falling rain, performing this final dance with her. But there was nothing final about this. This was one of many more to come, blessed dances with the woman that loved her so much. What more could she want? Except,
I want to marry you. One day.
While the statement sounded audibly more like a question, its intention could be nothing further from it. Helen couldn't believe she'd even said it. But her surprise was not for any reason of disbelieving it. On the contrary. She knew without doubt she had never felt this way about anyone in her life. Pearl was the only person she'd even felt attracted to, much less a love this immense and absolute. She knew this wasn't a conversation to be had right at this second, but she truly hadn't been in control of her mouth when it had given her away. This wasn't the time. And it certainly seemed she had picked the wrong time to be bold, as she watched Pearl's entire face change at hearing her proclamation. Her reddened eyes immediately shone before bubbling over with frantic tears, their brows following along and subsequently arching. A blotchy pigment rose from cheek to cheek across her nose, which began to run in an instant. It appeared as if she were attempting to force her lips closed through the desperate pull of her jaws, awkwardly scrunching before flinging undone. Her feet scrabbled behind Helen to hold herself up, and Helen instinctively straightened, pulling Pearl along with her. Her plan had been to let her go and to ask if she had gone too far, but Pearl had other plans. As soon as she was standing up properly, she practically collapsed again against Helen, clutching at her small body with her head hanging over her shoulder, where she hacked out sobs of pure and utter heartbreak. Helen felt her body shivering against hers, but it was difficult to tell whether that was purely from being cold and wet, or whether the emotion had torn another hole in her soul, or if it was both. That seemed a likelier option. A tiny part of her was afraid her proclamation had had something to do with it. Regardless of the reason, it was pure agony witnessing her in so much pain. Not too long ago, Helen would never have been the person Pearl would have confided in for something as tragic as this. The fact she was now clinging to her like her life depended on it, over a shared tragedy such as this, it killed Helen. How much everything had changed. How much this was a familiar pain. How much things stayed the same. She stood stunned for a moment, suspended in space as the realization that Pearl was no longer scared of her hit her with full force. Her presence was no longer anxiety-provoking. It was actually a comfort now. Her Pearl. Her Pearl. Stardust had its way of finding its other half, it seemed. Unlikely partners such as they were. They were home.
Pearl, I'm sorry. I'm sorry if that wasn't the right thing to say. It just...
No.
Pearl cut over her through the violent falling of her tears, clinging tighter to the only thing that was keeping her from surrendering entirely to the pain.
I want to get married too. That's not it. I'm so fucking sad, baby. It hurts so much.
That was something Helen knew all too well. Despite her heart glowing at Pearl's confirmation to someday make this official, the fact that she knew what Pearl meant with all that she was kept her from being too happy over it. That was a topic for another time, a time after considerable healing had taken place. For lack of a better way of putting it, now was the time to hurt. If not now, then it would come later, and Helen knew that was the last thing they needed. The more they felt now, the less they would be plagued with later in life. That had been a conclusion she had come to far later than she should have, but it was something she could help Pearl come to as well, as partners did. Her arms slowly found the strength necessary to raise and to hold onto the insides of Pearl's elbows, brushing a tepid kiss against her wet hair. She had heard of the tired trope of kissing in the rain before, and had even grown rather fond of seeing it in media. The rain normally lent itself to the overall performative flair to the honestly overdone motion of a kiss, gave the scene an air of drama, and could even play into character dynamics and how well the couple have grown compatible over the runtime. For example, there could be something to be said of how much they don't mind about having this intimate moment in an uncomfortable setting, because the love they have for the other is greater than the ick factor of being in wet clothes, with slippery lips which are unable to stay on topic. How much do they care that the other can see them looking off-putting like that? Hair flat on their head, clothes hanging off of them, makeup running, all number of things. Did the kiss precede an argument, leading to the dramatics of it all? Have they been standing having the preceding conversation, or has one been chasing the other? The fact of whether they're panting or not is a detail which can affect how the kiss feels, from how much time of it is spent catching dribbles of air from the corner of their mouths. If this isn't their first kiss, how does this compare to any other time they've kissed? What differences are there? Was it outright passion that had spurred one of them to pull the other in and initiate the kiss? Or was it in response to something? If so, good or bad? Regardless of any of those finer details, the kissing in the rain trope is seen purely through the lens of it being romantic in some way. As if there contains a scene like that in a piece of media, it's probably preceded a hell of a lot of preamble. It's triumphant, it's relieving, it's dramatic, it's romantic. This was anything but. This was a kiss actively participated in by only one member, purely done because she didn't know what else to do. The love of her life was falling apart in front of her, over a pain she knew all too well, and words continued to fail her. She hoped that Pearl would hear every passionate paragraph it was meant to symbolize. She hoped every single word swirled within it, and gave her the same reassurance as if it had been properly spoken. She hoped the hell trapped inside her would settle, even for a moment, through this tiny motion she wasn't even sure Pearl had been able to feel. In case none of this were the case, she knew she had to say something.
I know, love. I know it hurts.
Because she did know.
I know. I'm here. I've got you. I'm here.
That was all. Because she was.
Thought you two never get here.
Whether intended or not, Helen scarcely believed that that sentiment could have come across so accusatory if Rory had tried, and certainly it sounded as if he had tried, at least to her ears. The scene had been to the tune they had both expected to find upon their arrival. The younger couple, arm in arm, contentedly eating their dinners upon their laps on the couch, hunkered beneath their plush yellow blanket they always dragged out on cold, stormy nights such as this one. watching a show neither could place in their compromised states. Looking comfortable, clearly having already showered, and settled in for the night. Having looked up as the front door squeaked open to smile at their dear friends. Even finding some humour in how they were both dripping rainwater across the carpeted entranceway. If only they knew how unbecoming this assumption was.
Oh, look at you both.
Maria had laughed in jest.
You look like drowned rats.
Rory had then continued the joke. Practically hearing the emblematic snapping of that thread Pearl clung to for metaphysical homeostasis, Helen flicked a downcast, tertiary glance across to see Pearl's watery gaze trained on an undetermined amount of carpet a ways away from her. Seeing all too well the utter hurricane swirling away inside her soul, even felt its eye piercing through her own. Numb static. She knew the feeling which was greying out the rest of Pearl's senses all too well. It almost made her sick to see, and she was unable to respond from the metallic taste it sent scraping up her throat. Before she'd had the chance to look up again or respond anyhow, Maria was continuing as if she somehow couldn't tell they were both breaking apart at the seams right in front of her.
Well, you best get out of those clothes and get warm. You'll catch your death otherwise.
If that same thread had just snapped beneath creaking pressure, now it had disintegrated in her hands, dissolved by the warm salt of screaming tears. If there had been a worse expression to use in that moment, Helen would love to see it in writing, because she was running a total blank on what it could possibly be. She watched the snap of anger come over Pearl's otherwise emotionless expression at the utterance of that disgustingly ill-suited phrase, and she felt her broken heart quickening at how she saw this reunion going. Pearl lashing out, not explaining what the actual issue was, their friends misconstruing and furthering the matter, her standing useless in the corner, and an unnecessary spat happening when that was the absolute last thing either of them needed. She was unsure whether she should try and get Pearl out of there before any of this eventuated, or whether she should allow her the space to make that decision for herself. All she knew is that she couldn't just stand there in a slack-jawed stupor. She wasn't a wallflower. She was an equal member of this partnership. She had to experience this with her now, and that included being her voice at times, at least temporarily. She of all people knew that a certain level of emotional advocacy was a necessary evil in these awful situations, and she was willing to be that for her. So, she had to dislodge this faltering voice of hers now, and use it as defiantly as if it came from another's mouth. Please give her the strength to do so, because that too was faltering.
My dad's dead.
That hadn't been her voice at all.
Oh, God.
No.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
It had been Pearl to break the silence between them. And yet still that same silence stretched on afterward, Helen never having found that flagrant voice of hers. Not even to offer some fucking word of bereavement. No rainy kiss could communicate what she knew had to be said, and what she wanted more than anything to be able to give. She had nothing to offer, and undoubtedly outwardly appeared totally indifferent, if that inclination could be any further from the truth. Pearl shouldn't have to be the one to announce such a thing. She shouldn't have to be the strong one. But Helen was unsure whether she, realistically, could be that for her. If she had to pull up a scientific term here to get her point across as effectively as she knew how, she had gone nonverbal, which had been a persistent problem all throughout her life, which enjoyed showing up just when she needed it least. She couldn't control it, but now wasn't the fucking time. But she supposed times like this were when it was most likely to occur, after all. So maybe now was the time. Shame smoldered in her gaze. She felt it dripping from her rubbed raw eyelids. She couldn't look up. The force it took to mute her heartbroken groans kept her head bowed over, the only thing she could voice having to be stifled. That useless voice of hers still quivered aimlessly in her throat, which she had braced shut the best she could. Come on, you stupid bitch. Fucking say something. Her inner voice seemed to have no trouble filling in the physical blanks for her. Now's the time to prove you can be a decent fucking person. Don't just sit there in silence, you fucking child. Child. Yes, she supposed that was right. that seemed to fit. After all, only a child would stand here crying instead of helping their partner. Only a child would try to speak, a voice still technically present, only for no words to come out. Only a child would be submissive to their own trauma when a loved one is being actively traumatized before their eyes. She wanted her dad, her own dead dad, while Pearl's had only just now died. How she, as a fucking grown-ass adult, could be all those things at once was fucking beyond her. How the ragged ditches left in the wake of mourning could so effortlessly alter sensibility's course was a feat almost seeming impossible, and would certainly be so for any truly self-respecting adult. Not that she would know. Yet still that silence reigned on, proving it not. She had no strength necessary to break it. She had nothing.
No. What? What do you mean? Are you serious?
The shocked voice of Maria was suddenly enveloping Helen's clenching head. It truthfully existed the only thing in her space, as was the exact opposite of how she normally experienced the world. Suddenly the only sense which appeared to be working was her hearing. Perhaps it was just because she couldn't open her eyes, she wasn't entirely sure of their status, but she could no longer see, could barely tell in what position her body held itself, nor feel the clothes in her trembling body, nor perceive her own outcrop of the earth. She couldn't even attempt to be there for Pearl in that moment. She didn't even know where she was, or what she would do with that information if she did know. She was so fucking juvenile, it was almost comical. If but a shred of humor could possibly be gleaned from a situation so abhorrent. She had instinctively reached a hand out for Pearl to take, another silent gesture which hopefully would speak volumes, but hadn't been aware that she had in fact taken it, only to drop it a few moments later. Pearl didn't want what she was capable of giving. It wasn't good enough. But she probably could have come to that conclusion on her own, even without that outside reminder. The capillaries running through her chest were hopelessly ablaze, burning her down from the inside out. There's no chance to jump from the burning window if you're also the house on fire. Nowhere to escape to, when you're nothing but you. Please give her strength to stay and die when the house came down, for jumping was the way of the weak. And she wasn't weak, she'd never been weak. There was still a house to burn after all.
Yeah, really fucking serious. So fucking serious. Do you actually take me for a bitch who joke about something like that?
No, she was going to lash out, exactly as she had predicted. Fuck no. Grief-riddled rage was a misery she knew all too well was radically potent. No one deserved that coming down upon them, especially not on people as well-intentioned as their friends. But wait. Was Pearl's way of dealing with this worse than the fact she'd experienced it at all? Did the pain hidden behind her fury become unimportant when expressed improperly? Helen knew that not to be the case. Truly she did. It was a conclusion she had eventually come to. Right? It was. She was sure she had. Pearl wasn't the enemy. She never had been. And she never would be. Helen had thought she had gotten that through her head by now. Had those 3 years she had been at her absolute worst with Pearl become obsolete on a dime? Had she not dragged her own name through the dirt more ways than she could count, so that she could grow and become a better fucking person? You'd revisit a feeling as wretched as that, even at a moment so tenuous as this? Pain meant growth, and growth meant change, and change, hopefully, meant better, right? That's the way she remembered it. Her pain meant nothing if she couldn't use it to grow. Then it was just pain. Senseless disparity. A voiceless scream. A baseless accusation. An answer to a question no one asked. Helen felt an acidic weight sliding into her throat, unconsciously shuffling her footing as she audibly swallowed in a fervent attempt at clearing it. Pure acid flooded her sinuses, her bones, her fucking skin anyhow. Literally no effort was alleviating any damn factor to her situation. As you deserve, you heartless fucking bitch.
I know I'm so sorry. I didn't mean that at all. No, I just meant we were just, I mean,
She heard Maria backtracking, a desperately apologetic tone so clearly audible. That wasn't like her. Talking someone down in a situation like this was second nature to her in her line of work. She always knew what to say. How could the therapist not know what to say? If that one fact wasn't enough to cement this moment as truly nightmarish, Helen wasn't sure what else would do it.
I'm so sorry, Pearl.
Rory suddenly cut over her, their places seemingly switched, ever the meek.
I'm so honest to damn God. Really drawing a blank here. I didn't even know that you... Well, that you even had a...
He thought better.
What? How did you even find out? We thought you were just going to one of Helen's
Oh,
appointments.
that's exactly what we were doing. Yeah.
Pearl, sounding further and further away, interrupted, an awfully familiar emotion rising in her voice. Helen knew it so fucking well. She was ashamed of how many times she herself had caused that tone to emerge, and hearing it now, even if she herself hadn't been the cause, sent her right back to that place. Such an emotion still existed within her, and could be brought out with some kind of provocation. With the cessation of their frankly toxic, almost if not entirely abusive situation, hadn't that emotion meant to drain completely from her? As that couldn't possibly be an emotion she had known before Helen got to her. Why did any form of anger still remain inside her? Only she had ever made her any kind of mad, or feel any kind of pain. Right. Like there's never been any reason for any of that, other than you. God, she was self-centered. She felt the front steps fully take to the flames, trembling helplessly as still silent tears dripped down to the carpet, joining the already present puddle of rainwater beneath her feet. The actual memories themselves were beginning to be lost on her, but the feelings they harbored, those stayed. And she would dare say, worsened. There had never been a real excuse for her to treat Pearl the way she had, no matter how she may have tried to excuse it. It really had just been cruelty, and she was more than capable of acting in such a way. She had more than proven that. That was the fucked up thing. I would never? False. She would. She had. She made herself sick. Truly fucking sick.
Yeah, but life has a funny way of fucking itself and you. He had to go into a home really early after he... Well, it was our fault, you see. If I hadn't been fucked over and a fucking hurt child, he wouldn't have had to... No, don't tell them that. Won't that change their perception of you? My fucking fault, you see. And that's what anyone you ask would say too. And because me and my stupid ass with my stupid fucking sister just seemed to make our stupid father fucking worse coming around, we just fucking stopped because what the fuck else were we supposed to do? And I brought her with me to this dump of a country to be with Will's... Or... maybe no. What it probably was that I was too fucking selfish. And I up and left to not have to deal with it. God, isn't that right? It's not Perry's fault. Obviously not his fucking fault. Gotta be someone's.
No, it wasn't her fault. It was no one's, and especially not hers. Helen couldn't believe she had just remained silent this whole time while all this went on, when Pearl could clearly benefit from a little input right about now. She wanted to protest that none of this was her fault, that she had been allowed to go and live her life the way she felt it best to, that the level of responsibility that had been expected of her should have never fallen so squarely upon her shoulders, and that she'd always done her absolute best despite everything. She wanted to say so much, and how could she say all of that when she knew good and well she'd been in an eerily similar situation growing up? It was frankly a little disquieting the amount of parallels that could be drawn for the two of them. She wanted to tell her what she wished she herself had known all those years ago. but it was almost as if her jaws had stapled themselves shut. And still she remained, quite literally suspended in space, sagging forward with her arms cradled to her chest, able only to hear. She bore no other tether which told her she still existed. The glass of the windows had shattered from the intensity of the heat, giving her an easy out. But it was either the guarantee of slashes on the jagged window frame, or the foolish determination to fall alongside the foundation, that ruled it out as a possibility. There was no easy out. There weren't even multiple options. The burning saga which had peppered most of her lucid life had one concrete conclusion, and it didn't include jumping. What she did while she waited was the only possible variable. Helen Louise Steele, just sitting here waiting to burn. They'd praise her for the courage while mocking her for a fool. The answer to a question nobody asked.
Say something!
No, but that doesn't mean...
Rory was promptly cut over.
But yeah, fucking get on with it, Pearl. Got the call on the way home, and boy did they not skimp on all the descriptions. Like, I get it. He fucking died. Haha, fucking cool. Gotta paint me the damn picture?
And in a single moment, fear collapsed her lungs at remembering those fucking descriptions, and that inward voice was running ahead with something foreign, from somewhere deep inside her, something so deep she tended to make out it didn't exist. But by fucking God, did it.
At least you never had to actually see it.
Jealousy? Was she seriously feeling jealousy? Over someone else's experience with a dead relative? Jealous over someone else's trauma. Right. Where the fuck did she get off? Where in the actual fuck did she get off? Getting this far in life and seeming to not have learned anything from her experiences? Her ribs spasmed on the next breath. Even aside from that inner dialogue outing her for who she truly was, where did it get off targeting Pearl like that? Do what they had to about herself, but not Pearl. It wasn't a fair comparison to make by any means. There indeed had been differences between their experiences, and that was one of them. But that was no one's fault. No one's except yours. That was right. That voice had never been more correct than it was with those two terrible words. If it were possible to spiral any further down this pipeline, this was when the downward incline began, dropping off into endless absolution. Now not only was her own thread fraying, it was the only thing she dangled from above that murky sleep of death. She breathed metastatic fire. Static corrupted her extremities and lungs, slopping against her flesh and bone with no real vindication, simply swishing this way and that, clustering on contact and emitting their very own madness. Pure heat engulfed her deadened senses, bitter, sour heat, which clumped in the back of her throat and stung her nose. Whatever she physically stood upon spun her in a disturbing, unwanted waltz, surely sending her blood swirling beneath her skin. She couldn't possibly get a breath through her cramped airways and past the flames, her muscles tight and unwilling against this acute degree of whatever this was. Grief? Potentially. Exhaustion? Also possible. Revulsion? Likely. Trauma? Likelier. Jealousy? Disgustingly? Maybe. Their self-destructive voice had no feasible way of making itself known now, losing itself in the raw volume of sound her mind had generated. No one believed her when she said that mental anguish almost composed its own soundtrack. But if no one else believed her, at least she knew. She'd heard it too many times not tune into the music dissociation will force over your ears to drown out the demons. As if her brain was perpetually scanned from the MRI of her body, and in a self-soothing manner had crafted its own earmuffs to muffle it all, to prevent the claustrophobic panic which would usually set in such an overstimulating environment. Was that her soul protecting itself? Protecting her? Did she enjoy it? Or did it come with its own trials? Was her one and only coping mechanism really that bad? The world was scary. She fled to the white noise in her skull, because that's all she knew to do. The static spoke her name, and finally, it appeared as if someone enjoyed saying it. The ulterior plane she routinely found herself dwelling in was the only safety she could properly rely on. Everything else proved transient. And if she wasn't careful, the safety she'd found in her partner would also prove to be transient. Please, God, just let her take a breath. She was fighting with everything she had for it. Please, God, fix the leak her lungs seemed to have, where any breath she physically took was so unfulfilling it was as if it had simply drained out of her. Please, God, strike her down if she couldn't do either. Her soul had emptied in anticipation for her body to be violated. Or was it the other way around? She wasn't sure. She wasn't sure she'd ever be sure of anything any longer. As if she'd ever reasonably been sure. Why couldn't she just be the partner Pearl needed right now? Why did she have to make this about her, like everything else? She really wasn't trying to. She wanted to stop, say something, more than fucking anything. But she lacked the ability to anymore. She'd held it together enough to get them home for all those hours. Now she couldn't possibly. After all, she'd been holding it together for longer than this. This house fire had raged on for decades now, and you can't stop the blaze from inside the house.
And you just keep standing there. And I really need you not to go into your own head right now. I need you right now, Helen. I fucking need you. Stop. Please stop just standing there.
Pearl sounded as if she'd been right up against it when she had cried out those words. And yet Helen could do nothing in response. Not a single thing. On the outside, it plainly seemed as if she couldn't hear them, but that couldn't be further from the truth. It was every other sense that was the problem. Helen desperately wanted to zone back in. With every ounce of strength she had, she attempted to pull herself away from oblivion's edge. But what she had at her disposal was proving to just not be enough. As much as she desperately did not want it to be the case, she wasn't strong enough to be the partner Pearl needed through this. At least not right at that moment. At that moment, everything inside her was moving entirely too fast, and she appeared totally catatonic. The staircase was caving in, revealing the seedy underbelly of the property, maggots dispersing from their wretched cluster. If you sat still for long enough, you could almost feel them squirm beneath your skin.
Really? I really fucking need you right now, and you're not even listening? Oh my God, what do I need to lose for some fucking recognition?
She was listening.
Now, Pearl, she's in shock is all.
Cotton wool metaphorically dragged itself across her tongue.
Even so, it's my dad, and I need my fucking girlfriend.
Dealt with my dad dying without any one of you, and I'm fucking trying. Give me time.
I know you do, but yelling at her isn't going to get you that. Just give her a minute. You can lean on us right now. We're more than willing.
The flames rose up her throat.
I know. Fuck, I don't know. It hurts. Everything hurts, and I just feel so fucking lost. I'm really not trying to lash out. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. I'm sorry. I love you all.
Don't cry. We love you too. Please don't cry. That's such an awful sound.
Don't cry.
She had dislodged her voice. She had just spoken those two words. She had. The silence which reigned couldn't be overstated. It wasn't a lot by any means, but it was definitely a start. If having a start suggested the presence of a continuation, however, it was clear that whatever this was may not even be able to qualify as a start to anything. Continuation unguaranteed. It was still better than nothing. She really was trying. Please let them see that. Let Pearl see that. She was who really mattered. Slowly, as if her psyche existed in hourglass grains, her senses began trickling back into her, where they should have always been in the first place. First, she felt the floor beneath her feet, then her wet clothes clinging to her. There was something so incredibly profound about how both these contacts cradled and nurtured her in totally opposed, unassuming ways, existing as her sense of touch finally returning after what seemed like eternity in a day. That sensorily deprived space had been in and of itself torture, if the emotions which had placed her there weren't enough. But maybe there had been some benefit in that position. There had been a sort of block between her and the most volatile of emotions. And perhaps that was an untoward blessing right then. Because the moment this buffer began falling away around her was when she felt the sickening snap of the house's floor caving in. And finally, with all that remained of her, the fire claimed the property. The roof was slamming down upon her now, all that she was, her very foundation, crumbling down around her in one terrible moment. After all these years, this had been what had eventually torn it all apart. Second-hand grief, ill-bespoken. The fear of what was to come next overwhelmed her, the fear of the unknown, to be precise. How far would this haggard conclusion bring her to? She could only recall one other time that she'd gotten anywhere close to here, and the effects of that led to her becoming lackadaisical in the care of her mother, her grief of her brother leading to more grieving when her careless care cut her mother's life short. And she honestly didn't even feel that that held a candle to how horrible she felt in that moment, and at how adversely she knew she had the capability of steering toward. Please don't undo all the work she'd put into being who she was now. That was all she was asking for. She'd worked so fucking hard.
Helen?
She could almost detect a level of fear in the utterance of her name, spoken so softly, as if she were a pipe bomb set to detonate any moment. But wasn't she? Epiphora engulfed her eyes once again, flooding its essence down her cheeks in blistering tracks. She was blinded with it as soon as her sight had returned, and as soon as she had regained her voice, it seemed to become entangled in what she wanted to say and what would not fall out. Again, she was caught, spine atrophying, in limbo. Trembling beneath the bar, where would she go when forward wasn't an option? Wait for her back to break, or fall before it had the chance?
I can't.
Can't what? She herself couldn't be sure of that. She just couldn't.
Helen.
Maria's lovely voice, bombarding her in discordant fractals. It was assaulting her, and her fractured soul sat openly anticipating it. She fought to hold herself together from the outside in, mending a tear deep inside her from the other end of a brick wall. She felt it clawing at her ribs and forcing down on her throat.
No, I can't. No, I can't. I can't do it. I can't do fucking it. I can't.
Can't what? She rummaged about to deliriously shove her intestines back into her torso, breaths heightening in speed and pitch.
Helen, it's okay.
Oh, absolutely do not give her that shit. Nothing was okay. Nothing was ever going to be okay. Nothing had ever been okay. Nothing, not a single fucking thing was fucking okay.
No, it's not. It's never okay. I can't do it. Please. I can't. I can't.
Can't what? If repeating yourself was a surefire way to magic the definition into existence, then she guessed this may well be a prerogative, but if not, then it was a very definition of insanity, and her experiences thus far in life were urging her to the latter. Maybe she was saying she couldn't breathe, but that wasn't entirely true. She definitely could breathe, but she had next to no control over it. Can't get control, can't get a grip, can't grow the fuck up. It was to know.
Slow down. It's okay.
Shut up, 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 shut up. Stop swearing, you're just a child. Maybe this time she meant she can't slow down, which would make sense because she couldn't, but that didn't explain before.
God, I can't. God, I can't. Fuck. Why? This God. I can't.
She was thoroughly past trying to psychoanalyze herself. She truly didn't fucking know.
Maria, what the fuck is wrong with you? Why does she deserve all this, but you couldn't give two fucks about me? 'Cause Helen, you're so goddamn important, right? My dad dies, and not even then do I have some stupid fucking attention. My fucking god, Helen, stop! Just once, just fucking once. This isn't about you!
Pearl's words stabbed blinding hot pain through her flooded eye sockets right through to the back of her skull. A further clenching meeting this pain's arrival, as if her actual bone was spasming like a dehydrated muscle. Alternating burning chills spilled down her back and froze her senses with the juxtaposed ferocity of fire and ice. She felt so incredibly sick.
I can't, please, I'm sorry, I can't. Oh my god, I'm sorry, wait, no.
She can't. This time she knew exactly what she meant. There was no room nor cause for speculation here. This, without question, was clear.
I do care. What? And Pearl, don't talk to her like that. She can't help it.
She wanted to throw up, if she even remembered how.
Oh, she can't? Been around her and her shit too long. She ever tell you some of the shit she did to me? Bet she wouldn't. That's not the kind of thing you just want people to know.
Get away from me. I didn't fucking mean it. Hadn't she all but fucking murdered her past self to be the person she was today? Hadn't she been broken down to her most primal level only to relearn everything all over again? Hadn't she gone through hell and back just so the people in her life could stand to be around her? Hadn't she apologized to high heaven and vowed to never go back to that state, keeping that promise wholeheartedly? Why was all of it being thrown right back at her when she was in such a vulnerable state? How was Pearl being any better than what she was accusing her of now? And yet, she could express nothing but shame in response. Was that organic, or was it implanted? And did it fucking matter?
Please, Mel, I'm sorry. Please, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, please. I'm sorry.
Someone please intervene.
Pearl, that's enough. This is not the time. She's allowed to be upset.
Oh, wow. You're proving my fucking point right now. I'm not gonna stand around here and just keep listening to you baby her. Take her side. Do it. I could frankly give less of a fuck. Some fucking friends you are.
No. Pearl, wait.
A door slammed, her heart all but stopping alongside the awful sound. Fuck. What the fuck had she done? Oh god, what the fuck had she done? Fuck, she'd fucked the fuck up. And there was no way to fucking fix it. There was not a single delusion left in her mind of Pearl ever forgiving her. But not only for this night. It was clear there still remained a piece of her which hadn't fully forgiven her for all of it yet. And whether that had even been a possibility before, of coming to terms with it all and moving ahead, after tonight, it seemed to have all been but forcefully scrubbed away. Had every person Pearl even remotely still cared for been stolen from her this night? And had Helen, truthfully, even been one in the first place? The dampened night lay gaping, a ragged tear which blemished the lens of the mind's eye, insisting upon itself until it became not just a scar, but the entire scene. Rory stood visibly shaking beside Maria, having gravitated to her on some sort of primal autopilot. He stood close by, his breath coming in noticeable tremors, and he clearly hadn't been able to help the tears which streamed down his cheeks and rolled down his nose. It looked as if he were fighting his own intuition not to reach for her hand, but it was incredibly clear this was a suffering struggle, one which she didn't want him to have to face, when there were even bigger struggles they already had staring back at them. Maria swept her hand down to reach for his, taking it sturdy while hoping it wouldn't be rejected, because if she weren't able to help settle him down quickly, she may not be able to at all, as their friends admittedly were the ones more in need in that moment. She didn't want to neglect him, of course, but with this news and the subsequent argument, it was disturbingly clear that this wouldn't be something the girls would be able to handle on their own. This went beyond normal domestic disturbance. Deep, unresolved, and acutely fresh trauma was at play here, on both sides. And so if there had ever been a time they needed someone to intervene and play mediator, it was now. And especially right now, when they could both hear the corruption bleeding through the breaths Helen's teeth fought to hold back, and the faint but undeniably present snapping of some sort of thread. What they couldn't physically see, however, was how they sent oblivion hurtling toward Helen's tortured body, and how it tore her open on impact. How it broke already existing wounds and burnt her with forever fire. How it flattened her beneath the stings and fatigues of a prematurely weary existence. How it killed her in more ways than one. How she'd already been long dead in the first place. You can't kill what's already dead, but you can certainly brutalize risen flesh. Violate and rape empty and refilled space. Kill beyond the one definition. They could both see Helen's hand seemingly at the mercy of the other, clawing through her hair and at her pitching chest, as if her hands would truly be enough to hold back the unholy storm which had stolen the burning embers of the house that was her, right out from beneath her. As easy as if picking up sand. Her head was bowed over, so they couldn't immediately see her expression, but they knew it wasn't to be a pretty sight. Her seemingly shrunken body trembled like nothing either had ever seen before, seizure-like proportions seeming to fit better. And that aside, she appeared unable to remain still, tiny kicking steps rocking her back and forth, and attempted gesticulations falling short of a form, while remaining incomplete, as so many other aspects of her were. They could hear her shattered voice attempting to piece itself back together deep in her throat, hurriedly gather itself together lest she accidentally swallow it all down, never to regain it again. Its mission presented in the form of empty syllables, irresolute exclamations of a broken heart in active fragmentation. A display they didn't think they'd ever seen of her before. They couldn't remember the last time they'd even seen her cry at all, so this was sort of unheard of. How could perhaps the strongest member of their family reach this point? And what hope did that leave for the rest of them? Her name was spoken as a statement, not a question, as there was no need to ask anything. No, she clearly wasn't okay. No, they couldn't help. No, she didn't want to fucking live anymore. But the mere mention of her name, serving just as a reminder that she was in fact her, and what a fate worse than death, she broke. If there were anything left to break, this is when it broke, although she didn't think it possible that there was anything left to break by this point. And yet, she clearly felt the fragments crumble, so that they were no more glass and more akin to that of sand. How was she standing upright anymore? It felt as if she should surely crumble to the ground, lost within the swirling pool of herself which spilled out in all directions, flooding the fire which had surely taken to the lawn now that the house had finally fallen. How she could remain standing, breathing, when all that she was had lost itself in the despair, and had been broken beyond any hope of repair. She was going to die, surely, and while that thought was terrifying, it was also banked upon in some far-reaching crook of her brain. If she could fall down dead right then, she couldn't say she would die happy, but at least it would be over. It would all be fucking over. How was it strength for a voice to emerge, whether she was speaking sentences or not? As far as her consciousness remained, she'd already coughed out the lining of her throat, stripping away any final attempt to verbalize the unexplainable. Blood surely still seeped from the corners of her mouth and dripped down her chin.
Helen, please. Please come over and sit. Please. We just want to help you.
Maria's voice was firm yet caring, soft in ways only her job would have helped her achieve. But Helen couldn't see her through the burning blur which were her eyes, as if they were now entirely teary entities, meant for nothing but watering, burning, dripping, blinding. And now that they fell, there was nothing that could stop them any longer. There had been no let-up since she stepped foot in the house, which had to have been at least 20 minutes ago at this point. To her, it felt like her whole life had been spent rooted to the same spot. But in reality, the foundation she'd spent her 37 years of life building to this point truly had been completely destroyed in just 20 minutes. The mere thought made her feel ill, and for a moment she thought she may vomit all over the floor she strived to keep so clean. But in the next, she realized how silly it was to humor such an idea. There was nothing left of her. Nothing left to breathe, let alone to send up from her stomach, which surely was long gone by that point. No brain to send the signals off, or even to remember how to do such an action. So where did she get off thinking that she was capable of such a thing? With every passing moment, and every disregarded plea from the panicked couple before her, Helen fell deeper down the ladder, until any semblance of her essence promptly streamed steadfast from her. And it was then, and only then, that she finally collapsed, her fire stealing the remaining strength from her knees, sending her all but crashing to the floor. Possibly the worst sound either had ever heard accentuated Helen's descent to the floor, but where nature would dictate to distance oneself from such a sound, it only worked to draw them further toward her. Rory lurched forward as if on total impulse, but when Helen finally dissolved into violent, full-body tears, he hesitated ever so slightly, his stinging stomach turning at the awful sound. He momentarily felt too ill to move any further, so Maria made up the difference. She approached slowly but with purpose, crouching down in front of Helen, who had herself tangled in a menagerie of limbs and incomplete motions, clutching her tiny torso and screaming through every breath. It was a position Maria had found herself in many a time over her life, but she didn't believe that to be so in regard to Helen, the older, maturer, homeowner, practical leader of their family. It could be said, perhaps, that Maria could be seen as the more emotionally mature member, but she knew that to be the case purely because she was trained to be so for her job. Helen may have been taught a certain level of stoicism for her job, but a large margin of where she found her emotional maturity from was through her own experiences, trained to be so in a more streetwise sense of the term. Maria's was purely clinical, sterile, but Helen found hers through blood, sweat, and tears. Tears which hadn't been shed for far too long now, that being evident more so than anything else. But regardless of how it was found, Maria knew that this had likewise been long overdue and couldn't spiral out of control beyond this. From there, she was unsure of herself, and what Helen needed more than anything in that moment is at least feigned certainty.
Helen.
Her empty name hung in the air, in the same way her head hung over itself in real time, Maria wincing as she heard it too.
Can you please look at me?
She knew, in actuality, what would meet her when she would follow her instruction, but that still didn't properly prepare her for it. She could instantly see that Helen was further than shattered, an extant form of death which disregarded life. You would think death can't exist without the absence of life, but Maria knew good enough well that not to be true. And sadly, even if she didn't, she would know it now. The amount of pain Helen's lifeless eyes held was not something she could elucidate without concluding that, in this moment right here, Helen was as close to death one could be while still casting breath. The weight of one's own mental state can mimic the unworldly lows of terminal illness, despair running like chemotherapy, burning every living cell to make room for its estranged lover. Cancer held firm to chemotherapy, but one not existing without the other, as the treatment purely left more room for the disease. Chemotherapy was a gaslit soul, which flooded as lighted gasoline through eroded tissue, never having existed before he was told of the name cancer. He never knew life without the need of his cure, and thus lives and breathes the very dynasty which loved to reject him so. The cure was kept running with his burning tail between his legs, around and about for something which scoffed and bescorned his very existence. Maria thought of the possibility that Helen's own brain held firm to the very fire which consumed it, devoted to a pain to warrant a cure. Maria's heart wanted to break, but she held to herself, breathing deep and maintaining. Even if Helen hadn't fallen that low, she needed something solid to grab onto. And if her mind wouldn't provide her something, she would be that something.
Can I take your hand?
Her voice trembled slightly, but she forced it steady, likewise forcing back her eyes' urge to tear themselves apart in sheer melancholy. She heard Rory step toward her from behind, but couldn't pay him any further mind in that moment. If her focus wandered, her resolve would crumble steadfast, and they didn't need another basket case.
Please.
She tried not to make it appear as if she were begging, as the presence of begging was bred from uncertainty, something she couldn't even afford to consider. And perchance, she had succeeded in her emotional exterior, as she saw Helen's eyes register a brief flicker of recognition, and she moved her hand closer toward her own. Maria's heart flooded with relief at the notion that she had gotten through to her. But that couldn't last too long, as her friend's hand hesitated before it had the chance to bury itself in the embrace of another, and she watched as her eyes were replaced with forlorn oceans, her breaths tugging and scraping at her lungs as if they were edged, and each inhale was first to travel through a zigzag mechanism before it could be properly fulfilled. If Maria listened close enough, she would probably be able to hear the chain link raping her airways. Her first attempt to talk after this bled free of her mouth and dripped toward her unfeeling knees. Her mind drew the foggiest blank. She truly couldn't be certain of how she was even present enough for words to escape her. Her mind's eye rotated on a lazy Susan, tipping its way to either side at will, threatening to spill her over. If the acid bubble forcing its way out from the exposed grit of her esophageal wall were to pop, she would pop alongside it. She was the acid bubble. Deliriously, she drew herself inward, shoving her intestines back inside her and raveling up her nervous system. If someone told her she was sick, she would believe it.
I know you don't. You don't know. You don't want. You don't. You just don't. I get it. Believe me, I get it.
Maria gently interjected, sucking her teeth as the only outward expression of her uncertainty.
We both do.
Finding assurance in the fact she had her partner behind her, it was fair to assume it took her by surprise when she looked back to accentuate her statement, and Rory was no longer there. As silly as it was, but a brief flicker of anxiety flared within her hands at his absence, making the situation all the more real for her. But just as she had come to accept he had wandered off, to that she wondered why, she also heard Pearl's bedroom door close, and she could only smile. That was her Rory, never one to leave someone to suffer on their own. While she had been going to check in with her as a natural progression of events, she could, again, be assured that she had her partner behind her. Pearl was in good hands.
Can I come in, Pearl? Please?
Rory heard his already quiet voice tremble in his throat, and he reached up a hand to wipe at the constant tears which dropped like a monsoon from his inflamed eyes. He couldn't help but feel so useless in this situation, standing there dumb while his capable wife took charge. But she clearly knew more than him what she was doing when it came to de-escalating, and so if she took on the more virulent of the two, he reasoned that he could maybe handle helping Pearl. Rory had been there for students who had lost parents before. Maybe he could use that here. He knew it was different for an adult as it is a child, but he could only try. That was better than standing there like a wallflower, and Pearl truly did deserve whatever he could give, and as he knew resolutely, and more.
You can,
came Pearl's exhausted voice from behind the door, and Rory winced, nauseated at the unfurl of who she wouldn't allow inside, before twisting the knob already in his hand and entering, quickly shutting it behind him to give them privacy, and so Pearl wouldn't have to hear her girlfriend's anguish down the hall. Possibly, he was also included in that consideration. The combination of them both was genuinely sickening him, and sweat gathered at the back of his neck, dripping down his back. He swallowed back the imminent possibility of his sorrows drowning. Pearl sat leaning forward onto her hands, on the floor facing the bed, clearly having been about to fall onto the bed before the strength left her knees and sent her to the floor, just like Helen had in the other room. Her forehead rested on the side of the mattress, her shoulders physically bowed forward, as if she were praying, but Rory knew there seldom was anything to pray about here. God didn't appear to have known how to keep himself from killing an innocent man and robbing 2 women of their peace. Just didn't know how to help himself, and Pearl would know it, so there wasn't a damn thing left for her to pray about, except to tell her God just who he had betrayed that night. Her body shook with tears she was clearly suppressing, but the tiny hiccups and gasps she couldn't help but utter kept her from fully playing the part of a girl who wasn't completely shattered. Her legs splayed either side of her, making a sort of M shape, and Rory could barely see her head, which hung low beneath her spasming shoulders. Rory swallowed an acidic grit, rubbing his hand through his damp hair for a moment, before stepping forward, careful not to move too fast.
Why are you in here?
The question sounded as if it would be accusatory if it weren't for how tired she clearly was. As it were, it was mumbled dully from her mouth, as if it were merely a prolonged exhale, but Rory had heard, and wouldn't begrudge her her right to close off, as long as that didn't extend to meaning it in a physical sense as well. That bred nothing but trouble in his experience. He paused for a moment to think, taking another step forward.
I didn't want you to be in here by yourself. It's not fair, I don't think.
No, but wouldn't you rather be with Helen?
Discomfort seeped into Rory's hands at the way Pearl said her name, spitting it like venom from the mouth it burned.
Isn't she more important or some shit? And you don't think? Don't waste your time. Go help your fucking wife.
Of course, Rory thought to himself as he knelt down beside her, sitting down when his knees trembling beneath him almost caused him to topple over. While she may not be able to see there was clearly a deeper issue here from her own warped view, it was still a fair statement to make that Pearl felt nothing if not abandoned in that moment. It was her father who had just passed, but because someone else who there admittedly was bad blood toward from past experiences, had had more of a visceral reaction, her emotions didn't matter and were to be put on the back burner. He wasn't taking sides, but he certainly could agree that that wasn't fair to her, and the least he could do was provide that support which no one else seemed able to give right then. He may not remember his biological parents, but still felt their absence as if they had died in front of him, and could imagine that pain was likely tripled for her, if not more.
I think my fucking wife has it covered, actually.
He replied with a hint of a laugh trickling in on the back, hoping his tone wouldn't be taken as dismissive, as he reached forward to ease the hair away from her face where it was being dampened by her constant tears. She flinched away for a moment, but ultimately didn't protest against the contact, which in itself was a win, one which shouldn't be disregarded.
Plus, you're just as important, no matter what anyone thinks.
Why doesn't it feel like it then?
There was that combative reaction he knew had been coming. Rory fell into silent submission, his own shudder falling into place, as Pearl continued.
Why is she reacting that fucking much? I don't understand it. Why was Maria jumping down my damn throat? Like she's a fucking therapist. Why couldn't she think about how that would make me feel? Am I wrong? That was fucked up, right? I don't know, man. Feels really fucking...
Her lapse into silence worried Rory, the jittery exhale sealing the deal for him. But just like how he was out in the main room, all he felt able to do was watch. He was merely a spectator of the fucking shit show that was his life, and none knew that more than those who inhabited the same space as him in times of stress, if this could truly be described in such a minimizing manner. As he did, and as he does, he could only watch, as Pearl gritted her teeth and drew back slightly, forcing her head forward again to make repeated contact with the mattress. Rory would wince at the groan she uttered each time she made contact, his nerves creaking and swaying, and it was only on the 8th attempt that Rory was able to break himself out of his stupor by placing his hand on her shoulder, silently urging her to stop. But it was clear that he had taken too long in reaching this conclusion, as she no longer appeared accepting of his help, instantly recoiling out of his touch and slamming her face down against the bunched comforter in front of her, sliding it down toward the bed frame and letting out an almighty scream of pure, unadulterated anguish into the plush material. Working on an emotional buffer, Rory had no hope of reacting in time to the frankly fucking awful sound, as before he could even think to restrain her, she'd reeled back and smashed her forehead down into the metal of the frame, the resounding clash of metal and flesh likewise deafening and sickening Rory, who in response could only fall back and exclaim in shock.
My God, don't do that!
Fucking why not?
Pearl screamed back at him, whirling around to face him through the burning of her tears and throbbing in her head. The chill Rory shuddered with swirled in his blood.
You tell me why fucking not? What the fuck else am I supposed to do? My own fucking girlfriend doesn't care enough about me to not make my dad dying all about her. So why shouldn't I?
Rory knew himself to be a fairly even-tempered guy, but when push came to shove, he found it hard to control his emotions. He wasn't one to handle anger with grace, but the thing was that he wasn't angry at all. So why did his heart wrench in his chest, and why did his mind's eyes smolder? His eyes stung with regathering tears, and his hands shook and tensed together. His head spun, and he wanted to scream at her like she had him, for even daring to think so lowly of the woman he admired over all else. His mind blanking and his stomach churning, he couldn't possibly help his volume as he fired right back.
Because you shouldn't do that. What is that going to fix? And she does care about you. Can you honestly look at her reaction like that and think she's just doing it for the attention? No one goes to this kind of length just to get some sympathy. Okay, clearly that's not the issue here. She's also lost a parent. Don't you think she would know fucking better than anyone here how fucked it's made you feel? And I don't doubt that she's put you through the ringer in the past. She was kind of a nightmare when I first met her, so I fucking get it, bro. But she's one of the nicest people I've ever met now. And I know deep down there has to be something here that's triggered her. There's no other reason. She would never make something as serious as this about her, and I won't say you should know that, because clearly you don't. But you have to give her the benefit of the doubt here. She loves you more than she loves some fucking misguided attention.
All he felt was regret. He hadn't spoken a word of a lie, but he fucking knew he couldn't go off the rails like that in a situation so tenuous. He knew better than that. He shook violently as he came to a stop, the haze lifting from his sight as a flood of nausea and pain carving at his stomach greeted him back to reality. But he guessed he somewhat deserved to feel it if he was going to handle this so poorly. Maria wouldn't have reacted quite that brash. He wilted, running his sweaty hands through his hair and down his face, allowing them to settle on his stomach to rest against the worst of the pain. The silence coming from Pearl deafened Rory, and he worried he had spoken out of turn, making everything so much worse. He wanted to turn away from her, but found himself immobilized. His stomach hurt.
I'm so sorry. That came off so much worse than I meant. I'm sorry I'm not as good at this sort of stuff. I couldn't tell you the first thing about
No, you're right.
Pearl's interrupting statement took Rory squarely by surprise, enough so that he lifted his hanging head ever so slightly, just enough that he could look at her. His surprise only proved to grow from there, witnessing a true transformation of his friend's demeanor. She appeared no less devastated, of course, he'd expected no less, but she wasn't as closed off as before. And honestly, if Rory could say, it seemed to force her to hold her grief far more securely, more trust in the base to uphold the framework. Had he actually been of help? Rory couldn't be more relieved to see this welcome switch and to greet this possibility, as being as closed off as she wasn't conducive on any level in the pursuit of alleviating pressure. He already felt inadequate enough in this whole dynamic. Seeing his words had marked value was validating in ways he didn't think possible. The cramping in his stomach loosened ever so. Rory was no longer rooted. He shifted himself to his original position, hand remaining on his abdomen to dissuade further upset, as Pearl continued.
Look, I know there has to be something with her. I get that. And I'm really trying to keep it in mind, but...
Her eyes told Rory the end of that sentence.
You're allowed to be upset.
I'm more than upset.
More than upset. And you're allowed to resent her right now.
But see, here's the thing.
Pearl cut through a second time, raising her hands up in unsure, palm-raised gestures, breath sputtering a moment around her tongue.
My fucking dad is dead. He fucking died. And I was in another fucking country when he died. He was the last family I had left. And now not just my birth family, almost all of my in-laws as well. Everyone! Except Helen. And now when I've got no one left anymore, she has to react like this? It fucking gets to me. I know she struggled with shit, but fuck, haven't I? Couldn't I be a main priority for once?
Rory attempted to answer, but Pearl clearly wasn't finished even though her sentence had seemed to come to a stop, her pitch raising spasmodically. Rory hoped this tangent wouldn't undo the minute progress that had been made.
I get it, man. I really do. And it hurts. It actually hurts a fucking lot hearing her so shattered out there. I want to fucking help her because I love her and she has never fucking cried like this before. And it's making me actually sick listening to her like that. But I just wonder, is she hearing this? Is she having the same thoughts about coming in here, hearing me so upset? For some reason, I don't think so. And all I want right now is to be a kid and run to my...
Normally there would be a certain extent of silence which would stretch on after an incomplete conclusion such as that. But this time silence only came in the form of the absence of words, and where words could no longer define. Absolutely harrowing sound spilled from Pearl's mouth where the words should have been, as she was fully taken over by the misery. There was no space for her to be combative. All she fucking wanted was to be held and to be allowed the terrible task of breaking down. All she craved to be was an untethered monsoon, chaotic and destructive as it were, and allow the sensations to take precedence. She really did feel for Helen. Clearly some fucking thing was wrong and it wasn't just her wanting to make a scene. But right then, she couldn't worry about her. All she had the capability of doing was grieving. And grieve she shall.
Fuck.
She sobbed beneath her capsizing breath, unable to get a grasp on it as she clutched at her chest, trembling and choking on herself. Her sensibilities were subject to a roller coaster she had no control in, the track of which accelerated and broke off at will. She was hopelessly adrift in emotions she had hoped she'd never have the misfortune of being inundated with again, but alas, such as was the world's way. She wanted to be a kid and to run to her dad. She wanted her dad. All she wanted was her dad. She wanted to be a heartbroken little girl, running to the safety of the only parent she'd ever known, because that would be the only time he would even remember who she was. Dementia had already stolen him from her once. What was this last step in the fullness of all that was? He had no chance of lapsing into lucidity now. She supposed that was the difference here. Before, there'd been a chance, however brief it was. But now there was none, and there never would be again. He would never get a chance to see her become a better person, as in his mind she remained the fuzziest of memories. The little girl who almost never spoke and who wet the bed more often than she didn't, crawling into his bed shivering every other night. The little girl who likewise refused to eat and snuck food, and who always looked like she had just been crying. The little girl who was so obviously being hurt, yet no one ever helped. Without ever knowing the cause, all she would remain in his mind was the symptom. Was she a disease onto his brain? Had she been the reason for his degradation? Such a glaring symptom on a predestined brain. Had she been the cause of his slow acceptance into a quiet dusk coming early? Had it been her who had descended him down an aching cavern without lucidity? What truly had beckoned him to an empty bliss beyond this world? Had it been her own disease which infected him with a confusion so thick you forget forgetting? And now, his long decline was over, and as his place in the world fades away, had it been her to stop his heart and joy? It fucking hurt. It hurt in more ways than she could even fathom. Whatever had happened to her in the past couldn't comfortably hold a flame to this, and now that she was forced to surrender to despair, she thought how lucky she had been before. The way ahead felt lonely now.
Fuck. Oh my god. Oh, Rory. God, it hurts. I'm sorry for how I acted. I didn't mean to. I just didn't.
She hadn't been aware of her friend moving, only becoming aware when he made physical contact with her. His arms were around her. He was trembling and she could feel a dampness reaching her clothes from his face, but he held firm to her, hugging her. Rory barely hugged his own wife, at least in front of her, and he had most certainly never hugged her before. He didn't hug her as he would a partner either. He hugged her as he would a child, and she had had no idea how much she needed that. It was almost as if her dad was still here, holding her close and letting her know everything was going to be okay. He'd never had a chance to do that. He'd had no idea the horror Pearl faced as a child, and had walked a path of denial unraveling before his childlessly fresh eyes, and so she'd never experienced this in actuality. She had yearned for it, and craved for it, and screamed out in silence for it, but had never gotten it. For Rory's effort here, using what he knew about being a child's only trusted adult and what he knew better than Maria, it almost rang out in a tone of sublimity beyond loss, leaving her misplaced in time. This is what she always needed, and she was getting it in the wake of post-awareness confusions. But in the last moments of pure recall, she realized it was just a burning memory. And maybe that was enough.